Dr. Kory, thank you so much for taking the time to visit with me. Exciting conversation that I haven't heard you have anywhere else. So this may be, the first. But if you will, do you care to go into just briefly on who you are? Is somebody that I respect tremendously, but why we're about to have a conversation on minerals versus some of the other things that you're very well known for.
Yeah. Here's how I'm gonna answer that. I'm gonna tell you who I was and who I am now, because it's not the same guy anymore. I was, pretty high up in academics and medicine. I was the chief of the critical care, division at University of Wisconsin, and I was the head of their main medical surgical ICU called the Trauma and Life Support Center, and I was taking care of a ton of patients, doing research, writing papers. I wrote one of the top textbook in what's called critical care ultrasonography. I was an ultrasound expert, and then COVID happened, and suddenly, I was pretty well known in my specialty, but I called BS on COVID. It not quickly. It took me a little time. I went through a period of disorientation. Nothing was making sense. Certainly, nothing was making scientific sense, and no one was behaving what I thought was appropriately in what was an emergency. And I got quickly frustrated. Resigned from the academics. I couldn't stand what they were doing. They were literally doing supportive care only. They were too afraid to try anything to treat. And then I went back to my hometown where I did all my training in New York. And then I'll just speed up and say, I became a public figure of a small sort as a dissident to the whole COVID thing. I disagreed with almost every single intervention that they were doing. And I called it out all along the way. And as you said, before when we were talking, I got a lot of arrows in my back, and then suddenly I'm reading about myself in the paper. I'm just like, oh, that guy does not sound like a good guy. And then I'm like, oh, wait, that's me. So anyway, but here's where it gets interesting. I lost 4 jobs throughout COVID, and it was pretty clear I was no longer employable by that system, which was actually totally fine. I was done. I couldn't walk into a hospital anymore. And so I started a private practice, and it's done really well. February will be 4 years, and it was built actually with the sole focus of treating the COVID vaccine injured and the long COVID. And that is the most complex idiosyncratic disease that I've ever imagined possible. And I'm still learning at that. And that brings us to the topic today is that whole journey of those 4 years. I was a guy in the system. I mean, the knowledge and your therapeutics when you're trained in like what's called allopathic medicine is very narrow and curated. And when I started to take on these really complex patients, man, you run out of like little pills very quickly that work. I mean, none of the standard stuff worked. And so I started meeting all sorts of different disciplines. Naturopaths, chiropractors, osteopaths, functional medicine, integrative medicine. I don't even know the differences anymore. I'm just like, I know they're not them, And they started telling you about all these different therapies. Hyperbaric oxygen. I never cared about hyperbaric oxygen. Then I learned about that, methylene blue. And I would tell it there's probably 35 different therapies I've studied in these 4 years. And then that brings us to today. Because and I've been the other thing I became is a writer. I wrote a book, and then I have a really popular Substack. And the theme of that Substack is really sharing my exploration into what I guess would traditionally be considered alternative therapies. And they're real. They're substantive. They work. They're generally safe, and it's a constant discredit to the system for ignoring them because there's no way to make obscene profits off of them. But there's a whole world of therapeutics that I discovered, are not woohoo, nonsense. I mean, they're real. They have good mechanisms, and so I would say it's the most intellectually stimulating period of my life. It's been a little dizzying, very complex because so much stuff comes at me and the patients are so, every time I see a patient, I'll get them a little bit better. And then I'm always looking for new things to try to help them with. And so it's been a relentless 4 years of research while seeing patients.
From the outside looking in, it's definitely been a journey, and your Substack is absolutely a wealth of information. The books you put out are tremendous. You've taken on the journalist
Yeah.
role very, very well, I believe, and objective, especially as hammered as you have been. So you you mentioned, the vaccine injured. Some of these conditions are just really extreme and unable to even really touch with the standard model. And this is like blatantly obvious, right? And it's
Yeah.
everywhere. So let's go back to a little bit of the foundation that nobody really seems to talk about unless you're in a quote unquote functional or regenerative, and I think all of those terms have also been bastardized. But we're not talking about sunlight. We're not talking about the damages of artificial light. We're not talking about breathing or air quality. We're not talking about magnetism. And so you bring
EMF, right? Yeah.
EMF, right? Like there's a lot of these foundational things that we're not even addressing, and so to me, like that's paramount. But when you discuss the minerals, right? I want you to just kind of take off with this. You're looking at water, right? And this is a whole nother topic that has some different camps, right? Whether it's a Veda Austin look or Jerry Pollock or Del Goose, right? It's not even new stuff, right? Or Schallenberger. Like we can go back and on and on and on. So how are you connecting minerals and water as a foundational piece of helping people?
Good question. So my entry into this field, like the first thread I pulled on is because I think people know me as being open-minded, willing to take things seriously. Like for instance, I just published the book, The War on Chlorine Dioxide, and I actually thought it was BS a few years ago. I was introduced or I came upon it. I read a book and I was like, what is this? Because the book was so overstated in terms of the disease it could treat and all of these things. And then I did what any allopath would do. I went to PubMed and I started looking for papers to support what this book was saying. And it was such a huge disconnect. It was a desert in terms of published literature. And I'm like, this is nonsense. And I dismissed it. That was 4 years ago. And then actually, it was about a year ago, December. I just fell into a Zoom meeting from someone that was connected to chlorine dioxide. And they're like, hey, why don't you join this Zoom? And it was a Saturday. I joined in and I saw people that I had worked with in COVID. Really a very prominent doctor from Brazil, MD, PhD, smart guy. And he was in this chlorine dioxide group. And I don't know why, but when I saw him, I was like, there's something here. And I learned so much in that meeting. And that's what exploded me into the year of chlorine dioxide. But through that work, I met someone who introduced me, said, "Hey, I see you're interested in the chlorine dioxide. I got to tell you about this mineral extract." And I was really busy at the time, and I said, I want to dig deep into that. I want to write about it because it sounds interesting. And I kept pushing him off because I was writing another series. And then I can't remember what actually brought me back. I heard something he was talking to, I think he was talking to my wife about it, and something that grabbed me. And I said, what was that about? I was asking my wife about it, and then she said what she'd learned. And I was like, let me talk to him. And that's when I just dove deep. And so let me tell you the story about how it started and what intrigued me. So basically, what was presented to me was a unique mineral extract that has never been described or known about before. It's literally unknown to history because it's it was the achievement of a Japanese scientist who, back in the 1950s, the story goes that he was meditating on a beach and he saw a tree growing out of a rock with no soil, no water. And the tree was thriving, and he couldn't figure out why a tree would be growing out of a rock. There was like some roots going into a crevice, and he became convinced that there was a vitality and an energy in that rock. And he began to study that rock. And that rock is called biotite or black mica, typically formed via volcanic activity, although not exclusively. And what happened next is unknown to history. And that's kind of what inspired me to write that book. Because it's one of those things that just got washed away in history. So what happened with him is that man, his name is Asao Shimonishi, he spent 20 years trying to solve one problem and finally succeeded. And just in terms of history of science, I was using AI. I try to dig deep. Has anyone, any scientist, any famous person ever worked on a single problem by themselves and succeeded? And I could not find any example of that. There have been, for instance, Mendel, with the genetics and the hybrid peas and all that stuff. He spent about 12 years, and actually he died before the significance of his findings was realized. Tesla worked his whole life on a few concepts, never succeeded. This guy Shimonishi, 20 years, the persistence and determination. What he was trying to do is he was trying to extract the mineral composition of this rock. And he built furnaces. He tried heat and different methods, and he studied volcanoes. And then in 1977, he used this very, very, very high amount of heat with sulfuric acid. Actually, he rendered from this rock, this ancient primordial rock. It's considered to be one of the original parts of Earth's crust. He rendered this liquid solution with, and no one really knows how many minerals in it, because some of these minerals you need very, very sophisticated technology to identify and measure. Because just so you know, in our Earth soils, at one point, prehistoric times, there was probably 100 minerals in our soils that we ate regularly. Um, right now, there's probably somewhere between 70 and 90, but the entire country and all of nutrition science only talks about 14. I call them the celebrity minerals
Hmm.
because we have 7 major essential and 7 trace, and then the other like 60 or 70 never get mentioned. You have to go to the periodic table to learn about them, right? There are all these strange names. People don't know these names. But anyway, he had this complex, and they were all sulfated because of his method, which is unbelievably important, the importance of sulfur in terms of bioavailability, absorption, and bioactivity. And what's interesting, and this is why it's unknown to medicine and health, is because this guy was a chemist and an engineer. He was into mining. And when he found this extract, he immediately saw what it was doing in agriculture and in water treatment. So the rest of his career was spent devoting his research and time in agricultural applications as well as water treatment. Because this particular complex, when you put it in water, it will combine with anything in the water that shouldn't be there. And what does that mean? Meaning, if you put this mineral complex in a pristine mountain sort of vital spring or healing spring that are famous around the world, it'll stay clear. Nothing will come out of it. What's supposed to be there is supposed to be there. It's natural. You put it in any modern water source, oh boy, the results vary. It suddenly turns yellow because there's iron in. So when it oxidizes and combines with any contaminant, it precipitates out. So if you leave it for time, any contaminant in the water will sort of fall, precipitate, and you'll get sediment at the bottom. And then you pour it through a filter, and you're left with purified water, which is also, the traditional term is structured. In my book, I'm trying to advance a new term, which is called electrically coherent or sulfated mineral coherent, because it gives a structure and an organization to the water, which gives it certain unique properties. So it's really a water that would be most like you would find in traditional healing springs. And I pulled the thread and I thought it was about minerals. I thought it was about minerals for months. I probably was in my second or third draft of the book because I actually had to keep revising the book as my understanding deepened. And then finally, at some point, I was like, oh, I'm not studying the effects of minerals. I'm studying the effects of these minerals' actions in water, the water that it produces, and the effects that it has. And the other really interesting thing about this is I'm famous for my career of really researching what I thought was like a novel, new, interesting, unrecognized, potent therapy. So I don't want to go through my whole CV, but I became very early on in my career, I became an expert at what's called therapeutic hypothermia after cardiac arrest. I did a lot of work on that. I was an expert at bedside ultrasound. I wrote the leading textbook with a couple of colleagues. I got really into IV vitamin C. Did a lot of research on that. That's how I met Paul Marik. So I was always interested in, I just had a knack for seeing things that had value. And, I saw it with these minerals but it was the first therapy in my career where it applied not only to humans, but to plants and microbes and animals. Every other therapy that we use in medicine The only other species it crosses to is to like animals, right? So like penicillin is used for dogs and cats and cows, right? NSAIDs are like anti-inflammatories. I mean, the vets use similar, but that's where it stops. Nothing, the only other plant that uses something that we use in medicine is plants use salicylic acid. So they make salicylic acid, but I've never given a plant an aspirin. Have you? Right. And then like I've never given a microbe an aspirin. And so but this thing is literally it is foundation of all biology. And I'm going to finish here, and because I don't want to go on but I think it's really important. I want to make this point. In my research, I came across one of the most basic facts of life that I'd never articulated, which is if you ask someone, what is the material requirement for something to be alive? Most people will say, oh, carbon. Anything organic or living needs carbon. That is correct. But there's actually two other things. And there's only a list of three that is fundamental to have something alive, and that's carbon, water, and minerals. So nothing alive can survive without access to water, and nothing alive can survive without access to minerals. And then I go a little bit level deeper. Water that's demineralized, so distilled or RO, is actually biologically inert. It has no biological function if you have a demineralized water. Same thing with minerals. If you don't have minerals dissolved in your water, it'd be like chewing pebbles or rocks. Like it has no biologic activity. If anyone who's drinking RO or distilled out there, they're like, I'm still alive and drinking distilled. Well, let me explain why that is. When you drink distilled water, it's mineralized as soon as it hits your mouth. It's leaching minerals from your saliva, from all of your fluids, because everything's mineralized in your body. So you can drink it. It actually has health harms. It's been well studied. There's a wealth of literature on when they introduce demineralized water to communities and populations that there's a rise in a number of illnesses. But like, here's a classic example. And one of my Substacks, I had a number of people write to me, I've been drinking, RO water for 15 years and I'm the picture of health. And I said, you know what I say to them? I said, well, I smoked almost 2 packs a day for 20 years and I feel really good too. So it's not like acutely you're going to die from, or get sick from it. But anyway, I'll stop there because I kind of traced my journey into why I'm researching things, why I was compelled. But the uniqueness of this one is I'd never studied something that was like you had talked about earlier, foundational to all life and health. You need carbon for structure, and you need water as the medium for both minerals and carbon. And then you need the minerals to make the water biologically active. And so, really, when we use the word water, I almost want to change people's concepts of it. Like, never say water, say, I want to come up with a new word, water min or min water, to emphasize that the only reason that why that water is sustaining you is its mineral content.
Fascinating. So, one let's go into the what makes up, you know you know, life. What then in your framework, in your perception, makes is the difference then of a corpse and a living being, right? Because they would be the same, right? They would be the same makeup. What are you thinking then is that difference in energy, life?
Well, it's like any other functioning unit that does work, right? The pieces and parts become inefficient over time, right? They can't sustain. And so we all know we live and die, but basically what keeps us alive is everything alive has to produce its own energy. It takes inputs and it makes energy, right? Just blinking, raising my arm, doing anything requires energy to do. So everything living essentially has some form of a mitochondria, right? That's the power, making or energy making cell. And over time, the efficiency and the utilization of energy starts to wane. Things become inefficient. Tissues become calcified. And to be honest, the biggest, my belief is that the main driver of decay and aging is something called oxidative stress that you can't mediate or balance or buffer. And that's what causes eventually tissue destruction. It's almost like a car. You can have a full tank of gas, but if your timing belt is off, or you have some disturbance, arrhythmia, heart attack, something plugs up, suddenly that stops the whole engine, right? There's no more flow. And so there's various things that can cause people to die. But old age, without sudden cardiac arrest or anything like that, or an accident, old age is just, eventual decay. Probably from, a lot of it could be longevity could be tied to the quality of water and the types of minerals that we receive. And modern life has done immense damage to our inputs. We could do an hour on agriculture effects, which I've done multiple chapters in my book about the effects of NPK, glyphosate, and water. That's the other thing. People talk about NPK and glyphosate. They don't talk about the quality of the irrigation water and what modern irrigation systems are pumping into the ground. It's very volatile water. It's off gassing CO2. It tends to be bicarbonate rich in not a healthy way. And it's actually compounding the damage to our soils. And so we're not getting the nutrition we used to.
The way that you just described, death or aging, mirrors or parallels in my mind to Doug Wallace's work around heteroplasmy, right? The mitochondria's ability to produce energy, it's specifically water, right? Metabolic water that the
Yep.
mitochondria produce. So I find it fascinating. I think that that y'all are saying something very similar in that mechanism. And as it ages, the ability for the mitochondria to produce water goes down, right? Heteroplasmy increases. So there's that. But I'm also curious about what your thoughts are on maybe around self-assembly, because this is something that is so mind-blowing to me, to think that we're able to assemble through these molecular forces of, say, the glycocalyx, the nanobubbles that you've kind of hinted to. There's gases within this medium that we call water. So what do you think that interaction is? Is it a polarity thing? Is it magnetism? Is it electromagnetic? Like, what aspect of it do you think is coming in within that entire complexity?
So you use the term self-assembly. That's actually a foreign term to me. Can I say that it's akin to repair and regeneration and reorganization, or is something new entirely?
No, I don't think it's new by any
Okay.
means. So the way that I have been attempting to understand it, and I am not an expert, is I'm trying to understand the glycocalyx, right? Like the work around glycocalyx is like what forms it. Well, it seems that it's a sulfated polymer that is self-assembled, right? And it can be hijacked. We can make it thicker within like cancer cells, or it can collapse, as well as like coronary artery disease. Hypothetically, could be in this framework. So there are forces, right, that you're talking about. That's why I wanted to see your
Yeah.
idea between a corpse and a living being. This self-assembly doesn't happen if it's not a living deal, in my understanding. So the minerals have to have an effect on that, but I also think it's the bubbles,
So
it's other things.
we can connect on there. So I'm gonna give you my view, or an example of how I see it from my view, because this is a really potent example. So you mentioned minerals, and like I want to sort of talk about the water, because it's the minerals and the water, and it's this particularly sulfated composition of this broad set of minerals that organizes the water structure. So I call it coherent water, either electrically coherent water. And what is electrically coherent water? Means that it really can shuttle energy very efficiently. So it has an ionic or charged mineral balance. It keeps a pH range and an ORP that mirrors that of vital springs. And I wrote a chapter in my book showing the history since antiquity. In antiquity they didn't have medicines. You know what they did when they were sick? They sought out healing hot springs. And healing hot springs, I mean, and there was places where they had hot springs where one was good for like arthritic knees, one was good for like infections. They use different clays, and it's because these are really the coherent water. The way I see it is it organizes the response to injury, and I'll give you the example. Actually, now we're going to go too far afield, because we talked before, and I want to bring up what was the final link into the final theory that I'm going to publish the book, because I actually had theory 1.0, 2.0, and 3.0, because my understanding got deeper. And the final thing that came about is But my theories were trying to explain the physiologic and biological impacts of this water. I was seeing things that were so profound, so rapid. And at first I thought it was minerals. And then I thought it was, okay, it's not just the minerals, it's maybe the rare earth elements that we haven't studied. And this is a unique source of minerals that are, disappeared from our food. But the problem is this extract has the tiniest amount of minerals in it. And that's what actually led me to understand, like, there's got to be another mechanism. Because, for instance, a teaspoon of this mineral solution has 1 milligram of magnesium, 1 milligram of potassium. I mean, most supplements of magnesium is like 200 or 400 milligrams, right? Potassium is the same. And then when you look at the trace elements, it's in the micrograms. And I was like, this can't be a mineral impact. And that's when I started to understand that. And because I knew that it purified and made water coherent. And I started to try to examine, why would coherent water have these impacts? And out of nowhere, this is so bizarre. This Hungarian vet, by the way, I'm my father's Hungarian, my grandmother's Hungarian. They emigrated after the war. So, like, it was this weird synergy. But this guy from Budapest, he reads my Substack and he sends me a paper. And the paper is about this emerging field called biophotonic emissions. And I think he saw what I was writing about, what I was getting near. He said, I think you're missing this part. And he was absolutely right. So what are biophotons? So something I didn't know until I read this paper, but every cell in your body emits a small amount of UV light. And it's tiny, it's weak, it's minimal. And that whole field, as I understand it, developed because physiologists were trying to explain why cells were coordinating themselves so rapidly. Why could they respond to insults and injuries and oxidative stress? Because the traditional model that we're taught, which is chemical messaging, right? Like, your body needs something or it's dysregulated. The thyroid secretes some thyroid hormone that circulates around and hits receptors, and then the cells behave. But that's kind of a crude and delayed response. And they were seeing very rapid coordination of the cells. And so the hypothesis is that there's information being transmitted in this tiny amount of UV light. The key is this: for that UV light to travel outside the cell, it needs coherent water, or what's traditionally called structured water. That name is so misunderstood, misdefined, multiple definitions, multiple claims, that I'm trying to get away from structured. And actually, the more scientific and biologically precise term is actually coherent water. But if your fluids around each cell are not coherent, that UV transmission is degraded into noise. It goes nowhere. It cannot, it's too weak to get through what I call chaotic water or chaotic fluids. And so let me give you the example to answer your question. And it's actually a very personal one because it happened to my wife, and it always stuck in my head that I'd never seen this happen before. And I was always trying to figure out. And I think it's because it restored this intercellular communication by this biophoton. What happened to her? So we were actually going to my nephew's wedding. This was about 2.5 months ago. I didn't think of this then. I thought of it more when I started to realize what this was going on. But she, in all of her wisdom, she was using a clothing steamer while she was wearing the dress. She was trying to, like, and she unfortunately horrifically burned the inside of her thigh. And she screamed. I ran over. Skin was bubbling. This thing was nasty, right? And she is in so much pain and she's howling. And literally 3 days before, a colleague had told me to apply the mineral solution to gauze. Anytime you get a cut, abrasion, a burn, anything, even sunburn, just apply this mineral solution. And I was like, hey, let's put minerals on it. And we put it on. She held it on. She was in so much pain. And actually had to leave to go to the wedding, which was a few miles away. And by the time we left and we were almost at the wedding, this is within an hour, she said, "It doesn't hurt anymore. There's no more pain." And I actually have a picture. It was bubbling, like the blister was bubbling immediately. And by the time we got to the wedding, the blister had gone down quite a bit, like the amount of bubble. And then by the next morning, it was totally flat. It looked like kind of an abrasion or a scab, or yeah, like a fresh bruise abrasion, but there was never any pain. within an hour. I burned myself badly. That kind of burn you're gonna wear for a week in terms of pain, discomfort, like when you burn your hand. I mean, that thing hurts for days. This thing was a massive burn, and the pain went away so quickly, and the healing was so rapid. And then the eventual result of the healing 3 weeks ago was like a pink blemish on the inside of her thigh. No scar, no white, contracted skin or anything like that. And I was physiologically impressed, and it was only as I was working with my colleague he's not a co-writer of the book, but he's kind of the intellectual leader of the book because he's kind of, guided me through this whole science. He's been studying these minerals for 20 years, and so, um, we when we came up with our, water coherence collapse theory, which explains a lot of the problems with nutrition, agriculture, and all that, is that it's really the quality of our water that's actually compounding all of the problems of the NBK. It's actually a grand theory. It's a little complex. I don't want to go into the big theory, but in terms of with this burn, we believe that the application of these minerals to this burn basically restored intercellular communication and organization and allowed for this rapid healing. That's as crude as I can get and as sophisticated as I can get because I can't come up with any other explanation for why that response was. And I know a practitioner that I've talked with a few times. She's been working with this kind of mineral solution for 20 years, and she has these cases, these before and after cases of rapid healing of massive car accidents with abrasions where they heal very quickly. She's got a picture of like a kid with a scooter accident fell on their face, totally tore up their face, and she has the dates. And like 4 days later, you don't see anything on the
Mm.
face. I mean, it sounds a little bit overly dramatic, and I'm sorry to be that way, but it's just factual. I've seen this, and then I see other things in my clinic, and so that's kind of what spurred me on, and so, we actually the other thing that I was saying, is that the fact that I've had to revise my book so many times as my understanding has deepened, I also know I got a long way to go, and there's a lot that's I still don't know, and I actually can tell, given this broad palette of minerals that we've never studied, and that's actually another topic of my book, is that mineral science underwent this horrible truncation and basically termination back in the 1950s. And the reason for that is because the technology back then could not measure most of the ultra trace and rare earth elements. Europium, germanium, vanadium, yttrium, all of these exotic periodic table names. And the reason why, so they didn't have the technology to measure them only appeared in 1990, and for whatever reason, that whole field of mineral science, they never used the new technology to say, "Hey, let's explore all the things that we never explored." It just didn't do it. And so there's a big black box in terms of what the physiological importance of all of these rare earth elements and ultra trace is. Like a smattering of studies in agriculture or plants, each one finds biological significance. There's a few in animals, livestock, where they find biological significance. So a broad palette of minerals. Now I'm talking away from water. This is just minerals because there is two topics there, but it's a vast field and there's so little known because that field was unfortunately technologically limited in the 1950s and never reinvigorated when the technology came back.
Fascinating. So I have done a lot of interviews. And in that, there are moments when it clicks and it's like, this is worth it. And that happened when you started bringing up UPEs, because you aren't going super deep into that yet. But you just brought up one of the probably the most important things within the entire framework. And I am ecstatic that you're even on that, right? So that goes from, Alexander Gurwitch is the one that laid this out with mitosis happens with UV light, right? This is
Yep.
quartz glass. And then you get into Fritz Pop, amazing work.
Yep.
And then Roland Van Wyck and Maywin Ho, right? There's this whole progression that is happening within the UPs. So let, uh, I have a way of looking at that I may be, collaborative here. Uh, the mitochondria produce UPEs.
Yeah.
This is one of the mechanisms, right? And then you're talking about, cytoplasm, water. We have this a medium that is in there. The way that I try to look at it is it's like a movie theater, right? We're in a movie theater, the mitochondria are the light, right? The DNA is actually the film, whatever we're doing. You have the light that's projected through that film because that's a delayed bioluminescence, right? With the
Yeah.
DNA absorbs and emits light. And then you have the room, right, that you're sitting in, that you're observing, that's the water, right? If it's smoky in there, if it's cloudy, if all the lights are turned on
Yes.
in there, you can't see. The screen is melanin, actually, right? And so you have, when the system is broken down, this is why, we can see within Parkinson's or anything that has a degradation of melanin, there is a problem. So what you're laying out in the movie theater analogy, right? If the screen's broken, you can't see anything, right? If you just a laser up into the sky and you have nothing for it to interact with, you don't see a picture. So you're explaining or hypothesizing within the medium as being a really, really important aspect.
Exactly.
And I think that is fascinating that you're utilizing the coherence, coherent domains is what the original term was before it got turned into exclusion zone and all this other stuff. But um, I love this. And one more thing, I want you to go a little bit more. When you hit on light, and to me, we're talking about physics, and then we're talking about the regulator that has the timing, right? The timing of it is the problem, right? mTOR's cranked up or mTOR's cranked down, right? Both
Yep.
are problems, right? And so when we have a medium issue, none of the timing works. So when we have
Correct.
improper light signal, that's why blue light's a problem. It speeds up mitosis, or lack of red light, right? There is that rainbow in the worm analogy of the spectrums, and it's almost immediate, right? The signaling is immediate, and that's a timing within it. So do you think that what I just said is absolutely crazy? There's something in there, or we're going to be able
There's
to later?
overlap and connection. One follows the other, and I can tell you're more deep. I've spent 5 months in minerals and water, so like the biophoton was like kind of the final missing link. You have a much broader understanding of a lot of these other kind of communication, intercellular, intracellular communications, but you're clearly seeing my point, which is the medium is probably the most important for all of that. No matter how energy is being transmitted, what it's using for, what it's reflecting, how it's being interpreted, you need, I don't want to say high quality medium, you need coherent water. That's how the energy travels through. I mean, water doesn't store energy, but it travels through, and you need coherent water, and I think it's the key to a lot of things, and it's you know, I'll go even bigger than this. So you're talking about all these mechanisms. I'm gonna stay big picture. So when I said that this solution had, like, almost no minerals in it, that is an overstatement. There's 2 minerals that are actually at fairly decent concentrations: iron and sulfur. The rest are in very, very minute amounts. The reason why I bring that up is if you study early life science, the most accepted understanding for how biology began, biology is a study of life. How did life begin? Is that it actually, this guy Shimonishi, he was working with biotite. It actually began at biotite. So biotite is this really compressed, dense rock that's very iron, sulfur, and aluminum rich. And the way those 3 minerals interplay is that they were the first kind of interplay that could actually hold charge, allow the exchange of positively, negatively charged minerals, and cause redox reactions, which was actually creating energy. But the only reason why life was sparked is because that biotite becomes weathered over millennia into something called vermiculite, which is it now is porous and water can enter. Once water enters vermiculite, it basically activates it, and it brings up a bunch of different reactions. And that actually is mirrored. That physiology in that rock, you're going to be blown away by this. The same physiology and processes that occur in that rock are the same as in your mitochondria. Iron, sulfur complexes with magnesium and potassium and all of these positive cations like calcium. It's absolutely fascinating that the process in the rock is the same thing in the human. And You may or may not know this conceptually, but we literally come from rock. And what made the connection of the energy starting in that rock into something living, which is biology, is water. So the jump from geology to biology occurred through water. But what is so fascinating is the same chemistry that's occurring in that rock is the same chemistry in all of our cells. And so, I don't want to say like we're clones of rock, but we run on the same engine and processes. And so there's this beautiful kind of continuity, symmetry, repetitiveness of our basic energetic systems. Water is the key in all of them. None of them work without water. And so I love that when we were talking earlier, you brought up like, when you've interacted with, I don't want to tell your story, but when you talk to doctors before, they do not have foundational perspectives. They look at problems on the surface and they have little ways to, fix what they see. But when you want to go foundational, I don't think there's anything foundational than water. But again, it's a specific type of water, sulfated, mineral structured or coherent water is literally what began life. And that's what came out of rock. And that's, you mentioned Pollock. I mean, Pollock's famous for defining it as easy water near membranes, but that's also important. That overlaps with what I'm saying. But Pollock overlooked the importance of sulfur. In fact, he actually came across this particular mineral solution and he didn't see its he wasn't that interested. He was studying other things and he didn't see how important this would in terms of applications at scale, in terms of biology, agriculture, aquaculture. And when I say aquaculture, I mean livestock. What's the term when you're talking about animal growth or husbandry? It's not. Anyway, you understand what I'm saying. But there's applications to the health of all biology. What this mineral solution? So what I saw it do in clinic I'm starting to study it in agriculture. I mean, it is insane. We've done experiments. We've seen like little controls where you put a plant with just regular tap water and then use this mineralized water. I mean, it's not subtle. It's not subtle at all. So I saw the outward clinical observational impacts, and then I'm trying to understand what's happening. And like I said, I'm on a journey here, but I've gotten pretty far, and I probably have more to go.
Well, it's exciting.
Yeah.
I love what you've said. To me, what you also just laid out, I know we have like this huge divide between academia and creationism, right? But as a Christian, to me, I feel like we're talking about the same thing. And I think
Yes.
it's very challenging for a lot of people to maybe say that or see we're talking about different aspects of the same thing.
No, you're not. No, you're not, Logan. I was born up. I was raised without any religious exposure. My parents were purported atheists. I actually came to believe in my 20s through a series of circumstances in my life. I would say it was a relatively abstract belief, but it guided my life and my practice. I learned how to pray in my 20s. I went through some difficulties in my 40s, and my connection became more distant, less conscious. But my work in this book, I mean, you're keying in on something, and I don't want to sound like overly dramatic or leave cliffhangers, but at the completion of my book, I have a 10-chapter section called After Revelations. And in that section, I actually establish this is going to sound really grandiose the scientific proof of a creator.
I love that.
And it came from understanding minerals. And I'll just tell you the basis of it. What happened was my colleague, again, my kind of guide into this field of science, is deeply versed. He's probably the most deeply versed in not only scripture, but I would say esoteric texts, alchemical texts from history, various theological traditions. I mean, he's really deeply researched, and he kind of guided me things. And what we found, he already knew this, but we went to many, many levels. Is although that book ends up in some really scientifically dense concepts in terms of processes, the cycles that we were seeing, the grand cycles that we were seeing that modern science has defined, whether it's cosmology, biochemistry, geology, um, we found that described over and over in ancient texts. not only scripture, from many traditions, whether it's Muslim or Hindu, the same concepts appear. They have an exquisite knowledge for how from dust to dust, right? Not only that, but rock, salt, all of these things, those were not, those were metaphors. They map exactly to the cycles that we say. So my proof is based on the following. How is it that before we had quantum computers, the James Hubble telescope, you name it, hadron colliders, all of the sophisticated microscopes, all of the things that we define as scientific tools that allow us this deeper understanding, how come it's present in the text from antiquity? How is that possible? How did they map out all of these relationships between biology and geology and the cycles that we've now described so eloquently in our journals and our papers? It's there all over the place, every culture and tradition. So, how could that knowledge have been present? And I make the argument that there's only two possibilities. Is that this whole grand scheme, remember the chemistry that I talked about that occurs in rock and occurs in our mitochondria, that's just some serendipitous geochemical accident, right? We're just a big rock in space floating around, and some rocks combined in this serendipitous fashion, and suddenly it sparked energy and a way to carry energy in the cellular life forms. Okay, that's one view, right? And then the other view is that this was designed and that there's a creator. And I got to tell you, the evidence that basically because the knowledge is so mapped out, and in particular, the reason why I got to this place is because of Shimonishi's method. His method for producing this solution appears in text, very specifically in metaphors, but literally every step of his process comes from 1800 years ago. And he's Japanese. There was no knowledge of Hermetic tradition, of alchemy. That is a whole wealth of knowledge that never entered Japanese culture. He knew nothing of that. But yet his process was predicted and written about very, very specifically 2000 years ago. So that's basically my proof. It's like, how could that knowledge have been present when they nailed it back? Because someone was communicating to them.
Fascinating. I love it. I absolutely love it. Well, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. Hopefully we can just carry it on. I cannot wait to, for the final version of the book to be out. And it's you really made my day on the UPEs. Just so we're clear on that. That is very exciting that you got there. You did it in your own way. So, will you give us where we can go to look for the specific minerals that you have been talking about? How we can follow along and stay up to date with what you're doing, because we know that
Yeah.
you're heavily censored.
So, yeah, this is probably where I have to. This is new to me. I've never been in business before, but three-quarters of the way through the book, I actually started a company because I think these things are super important. Again, not only for humans, I think good quality water, especially in modern times, a way to purify and coherent, make your water coherent. So I have a company called Aurmina, Aurmina. All I can tell you is what it does for your water. I'm not making any health claims. I'm actually really interested in doing research, but yeah, it's Aurmina.com. And then my other stuff, if people like, were interested in the book, it's from Volcanos to Vitality.com. And then my Substack is Pierre Kory medicalmusings.com.
You're doing wonderful work, my friend. Thank you
Thanks.
so much.
Appreciate it, Logan. It was really nice talking to you.